Welcome to Reading the Room, a literary podcast featuring author interviews and discussions with bookish content creators. I am your host, Jalen, also known as The Bar in the Bookcase on YouTube. Today I am incredibly excited to be joined by Esther Yi, author of the debut novel YN, also called Your Name, out now from Astor House Books. I love this conversation for so many reasons, and it was such a joy to revisit it and listen back to all of Esther Yi's incredible insights about this very weird and surreal and original debut novel that I'm still thinking about to this day, as I think it's a book that's endlessly rewarding with how much time you choose to spend with it. I hope you all enjoy this discussion, and just so you know, this discussion is spoiler-free. We do sort of talk about the ending, but we don't talk about it in any concrete way, so I think this is a perfect introduction to kind of make you intrigued by what happens in this book. If you would like to support Reading the Room, I have a Patreon. Joining the Patreon gives you access to a bonus monthly episode of the podcast, which are chats with friends about literary discourse or other bookish topics. Also, you can receive access to my book club. I select a book each month, and you can join me near the end of every month on Zoom to discuss it with other Patreon members. If you miss it or cannot join, the book club recording will always be uploaded to my YouTube channel, so you never miss out. Reading the Room is an independent podcast, so every member contributes to making this the best literary podcast it can possibly be. Thank you to all who have joined so far, and I look forward to meeting more of you at patreon.com/readingtheroom, also linked in the episode notes. Other ways of supporting the podcast include leaving a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts, or otherwise sharing the episode with friends, family, anyone you know that loves literary fiction. Now let's get into the chat with Esther Yi. Esther, thank you so much for joining me today. So to start, the core of this book is all about fandom. How did you land upon fandom and the idea of parasocial relationships as the focus of the novel?
So one thing I've already, noticed, I've been following everything very closely because I guess the stalking element is quite big in my book, and that probably has a personal element. So I've been following, the little bit of commentary that's already transpired around the book, and it's completely understandable to me that people think that it's about, fandom, celebrity culture, K-pop, parasocial relationships. But quite honestly, these are things that these were not my, let's call them like intentional thematics as I was writing the book. Of course, like I deal with them. Of course, I thought about them. But I would not say that my book is about these things. And like the concept itself was really, 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 really simple in the beginning. So I was just on a bus. This was about 5 years ago. And I just literally thought to myself, I think I could write a novel about a woman who's obsessed with a Korean pop star. But that was the full extent of it. That was really the beginning and the end of the plot for me. All that to say, I never drafted out a plot. I never like drew out a plan for the book. And I never thought to myself, this is going to be a novel that's somehow going to be about fandom or about celebrity culture, about parasocial relationships. I never had that intention in mind. But it was really just the single idea that I had. Yeah, another way to put it is that the novel is essentially about a woman who's extremely in love, she's just like hopelessly, desperately in love with a man, or in this case, a very young man. Yeah, like I understand again. I really understand why people are reading the book in terms of posing some kind of commentary or even analysis or even some kind of critique about fan culture. But again, that was not for me the focus. And if anything, these elements of fandom, these sort of more contemporary figurations, they just kind of helped me to sketch out this story in essence, yeah, of the woman being in love.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I guess in terms of, I guess maybe fandom as being sort of like aesthetic concern, but I agree with you. I mean, even upon my read, as you get further into the novel, it really
Mhm.
kind of explodes from there, in particular in how it leans into more surrealist elements. And so I guess maybe to start with getting into our narrator and the love that she feels for Moon, I wanted to ask you about writing in a fictional format versus nonfiction, as this is your
Mhm.
debut novel. So just kind of open floor for you. Like, did this feel like your brain was operating on, I think, a different register when you were writing this book, coming from your prior nonfiction writing and then now writing in this form? I guess maybe I'm going to the question of like, the book isn't particularly commenting on fandom, as you're saying. And so
Mhm.
is that maybe why you wanted to embrace fiction as this platform to explore this character instead of writing, an essay about fan culture, for
I
example?
see. Yeah, this is getting at like a very long and intricate personal story. Would you want to hear that?
I would
story?
love to if you're comfortable, sharing it. Yeah.
Okay. No, it's not that long, I hope. I'll keep it short. But basically, okay, let's put it this way. So I was writing essays on mainly about books, music, and movies, I believe. I can't even remember anymore. This was back in my, I guess my like most of my 20s, early 20s. I'm 33 now. And then I decisively stopped writing all of this stuff around, I believe it was the end of 2015. And that was overlapping with a couple of years where I started writing fiction. Not to put this too dramatically, but my feeling about my nonfiction writing, so about these essays that I wrote, is that 99% of what I had written was a lie. And by that, I don't mean that I was consciously lying or that what I was saying was false or even all that bad, but there was a strong sense that I had, especially when I started writing fiction, that it was just not the right form for me. Yeah, and that was stemming from a lot of personal experiences too at the time. So it was not necessarily that I'd wanted to write about, it was not a case where I, wanted to write about fandom or study fandom and I decided that a novel form was best. That's not at all what happened. Again, I never thought about fandom as the thematic center of the book, as the heart of the book. It's more the case, just biographically speaking, that I was already writing fiction for some years. It specifically began in 2014. That's when I kind of committed myself to writing fiction concertedly. And then the novel itself, I started writing, I believe it was the end of 2017. So there were like these 3 years where I was just writing. Yeah, like I never really tried to write a novel. I was just writing shorter stuff, but I was constantly writing, all said and done. And so the novel itself just kind of organically arose out of those years of writing fiction. I guess to kind of approach your question more directly about why I guess like why I moved away from nonfiction to fiction, that is a very, very, very difficult question, a very complicated question that has so much to do with my worldview, the way I relate to my own life, sort of like the positionality that I feel as a, not just as a person, but as a, how should I put it without sounding very sentimental, but as a person with some kind of interest in more unseen and more mysterious dimensions of my personal existence, and those of the ones who are close to me.
To tie it to some more, substance of this novel in particular, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
one question that I wrote down, I guess I wanted to pin down your prose style and just the tone of this book. It feels so singular and original, as I was saying before we started recording. Like, it was so
Mm-hmm.
interesting reading this because as much as I, as myself, was bringing certain expectations to what the story was going to bring, they were constantly subverted. So I guess a good example is initially talking about the K-pop group, also called the Pack of Boys, and this idea of like eras. Just like as a side note, I'm going to see Taylor Swift this weekend. She's starting her like eras tour. And so I myself, growing up online, I've been very kind of embraced fan culture and loving certain pop stars, for example. And so I'm always sort of intrigued by this idea of, I guess, celebrity and different eras of pop stars. But what I think this novel is doing so interestingly is how there's an example here of the narrator reflecting on eras as being this sort of like evolution of being like civilizations
Mm-hmm.
and sort of making it, I guess, more macro and considering what it means to embrace a new era, particularly for, I guess, a pop star. And to tie it to the Pack of Boys, their latest era stems from a Korean translation of Sophocles and Oedipus's decision to blind himself. And so I guess all of this to say the novel is always walking this line of like embracing reality, for example, like a new
Mm-hmm.
pop star era, while also incorporating like existing stories, philosophy, and these sort of more grand macro, I guess, for lack of a better word, abstract ideas. And so that's a very lengthy and broad question, but I'm wondering how like your brain is working when you're thinking about these ideas and kind of towing this line between realism and blending some more surrealist elements in your fiction.
Yeah, I know what you're describing, and I think that particular moment is a really good example. And the thing is, like, I wish I could tell you that it's happening consciously in my brain, but it's really not. And I guess perhaps that's where the singularity, the sense of singularity is coming from, because it is just really ingrained in me. That kind of dynamic between, I guess, the more abstract and the more concrete, between high and low, it is very ingrained in my character and my nature, and also in the way I see the world. So I think that's just kind of organically bleeding onto the page. But to answer in a more, perhaps more interesting way, what I was saying earlier about the book essentially being quite simple at its core. Again, that it's a story for me ultimately of a woman who's desperately in love with a man, which I know in many senses that that's not necessarily like a hip story to present, I think, in this day and age. But that is what the story is for me ultimately, and I have no kind of shame or embarrassment about it. For me, there's a reason why this kind of story has persisted, and there's a reason why this story has a particular hold on me. And I think the frame that I used in order to deepen the story, in order to give it visibility, in order to give it presence, in order to give it a certain density of character, I used this frame quite not strangely, but there is something haphazard. There's some kind of discrepancy that's created when the story is developed within this frame of K-pop, or within fan culture, within the love object being a celebrity, and it's quite a simple maneuver ultimately. And again, I didn't think too hard about it, but what I sort of like intuited from the beginning is that if I use these sort of more, let's call them concrete contemporary markers, and I use them in order to develop out this age old, this quite timeless story of desperate, hopeless love, that something new would have to, there was no choice but for something new to come out of it. And in many ways, this collision of the timeless and of something, let's call it more quote unquote serious or more quote unquote literary, but the collision between those elements and something that's much more rooted in the present, and not just in the present, but I'm very aware of sort of adjectives that people attach to K-pop. On the one hand, it's viewed as a mammoth presence with a lot of power, commercially as well as culturally, especially in a global context. I'm aware of all that, but I'm also quite aware that there are definitely people who are probably going to hear about YN, so the novel, and think that, like, they probably don't want to read a book. If they are of a certain kind of reader, they might think they're too serious for a novel that's about K-pop. And these kind of tensions really appeal to me. On the one hand, there's perhaps there's like a basic apprehension on my end that my novel might come off in a way that I don't think it's supposed to come off. And again, as I mentioned at the very beginning of our interview, that's something I'm quite aware of. On the other hand, I take a lot of pleasure in it. I take a lot of perverse pleasure in that. I think that's really interesting. I think that is really dynamic, and is producing, yeah, a lot of interesting energy also for me as a writer, in the process of creating the work, but also in this stage, which is very new for me, of observing the way in which people are reacting to the book.
That's so interesting that you pick up on that and your sort of pleasure at seeing that response, because I feel like what I'm trying to pin down here is that sense of like joy that's sort of instilled in the reading experience of like you always, I guess, or the narrator feeling one step ahead of the reader. Because I guess I want to ask you next about the narrator and how particularly intelligent she is, and how she's very aware of these systems at play, and how she sort of, I guess, kind of aware of how she's not supposed to be, I guess, a fan, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and how it ends up really being about her love for this man. And I mean, one of my favorite subgenres of literature is this sense of like, I guess, longing literature. And I feel like this book is very much in that. And so I guess I wanted to ask you about, you're landing on this narrator, having her be unnamed, and how she's sort of defined by other relationships around her and her awareness of them and her commentary on them through her own, writing of fan fiction, which is incorporated within the novel itself. I guess, how did you think about this narrator while you were writing this book?
I don't know if I thought much about her, to be quite honest. And I'm not the type of writer who like has imaginary conversations with their narrator. Like I don't go for a walk with my narrator in my head. For some reason that question is very hard for me to answer. And again, it's not because I somehow also identified like very strongly with her and feel like she's inseparable from me. It's not like that either. I've already I kind of expect people to assume that there is a lot of commonality between me and the narrator. And of course, to a certain extent, that's true, but I believe that's also the case for every other character in the novel, because they're all emerging out of me ultimately. But at the same time, I myself don't emerge out of myself. I'm in constant contact with my environment. I'm constantly absorbing new things, speaking with people. So all that to say, like my narrator and all the characters included, I don't have a very, I can't say I have a very like concrete understanding of the way in which they were formed on the page. And I would say ultimately, as is also the case perhaps in reality in nonfiction land, so in the land of my personal life or something, but they seem to emerge out of constant collision with each other. They seem to emerge out of what their misunderstanding of each other, what they're expecting from each other, what they're encountering in each other and how they're mirroring each other. So I don't view my characters as these like highly discrete beings who must serve a particular function and have very specific personalities. And I'm sure that comes across in the novel itself that the characters have a certain ghostly quality, that they're not, you know, they don't really have backstories. They kind of drift in and out depending on the narrative. But yeah, for me, they are all of them, including the narrator, are formations in collision with other beings, with other longings, other yearnings, other forms of expectations from their own lives. And perhaps the most obvious collision in the novel is of course between the narrator and Moon. And also, and I feel the same way about Moon as well. You know, I feel the same about his character, that he too is not some kind of fixed personality, and of course not in the context of his profession, and he's named Moon. I mean, again, I don't want to like overanalyze my own book here, and these are things that are just coming to me right now. It's not stuff that, again, I didn't like plan this out or write this down and in order to like insert it into the book. Thinking of it now in reflection to your question, I think Moon himself, like the narrator, is also created in collision ultimately with the narrator. I have never once felt that my narrator is delusional. I really don't think she's crazy, which may be, yeah, that may be a little bit hard to believe, but I really don't think she's that crazy. For me, her understanding of Moon and the way in which she creates him and the way in which he is created by her, I refuse to just reduce that to simple freakish creation of her imagination. I think there is some element of truth in that mutual creation. Yeah.
What this book is doing is so complex on that front because it's very easy to consider this sort of relationship as being one that is, I guess, like rises out of delusion. But I think a huge thing that's going on here is the construction of Moon as a character and his own identity. It's like I guess myself as a reader, I was wondering, like, did we ever meet Moon? I don't want to get into too much, spoiler context, but as much as it is about the narrator's love for him, it's also, I guess, more so, in my opinion, about the narrator herself and her own relationship to her own identity. I think this book is very much, using its characters as an exploration of philosophy and ideas, and ultimately thinking about what it means to be human. I guess that's very like cliche to say, but I think it's true. I mean, the book is very challenging on that front, and I love how you kind of use characters as, I guess, a different tool in your arsenal that I haven't really seen a writer use before. Like, I can't really think of another example. There's this one passage in the book that I really love in which the narrator meets a woman at a party, and she says something, or here's the quote. It just says, "Literature murders, not the reader as one might expect, but the characters, who are no different from real people. Behind every character is a person out in the world whose sanctity is violated in the process of literary transfiguration. Every black letter on a white page is a bullet." And I know this is another character speaking, but I'm wondering, you as a writer, how you, I guess, channeled that passage and what you think about it in relation to all that we're talking about in terms of character and identity.
It's funny that you point out that specific moment because one of my best friends is currently reading the novel, and she's someone I talk. We discuss literature a lot. She studies literature in any case, but she's currently reading the book, and she pointed out that specific passage and found it funny, and I too find it funny. I don't. Those are not my thoughts. And of course, the narrator's reaction to this woman's explanation of her thesis project is one of profound irritation. I believe she says something like, "Why do you study literature if you hate literature?" That would be my response. Why is she studying literature if she hates literature? So that particular moment is supposed to, I suppose, it is designed to function as kind of ironic commentary. That's how I personally feel about it. Again, though, I don't know how important it is what I, as the author, feel about that passage. But I'm curious to know why you were particularly drawn to this moment.
I started this podcast in particular because I've been really preoccupied with craft questions and kind of wondering why I think certain things about novels. And so, asking the source about where they're getting these ideas from
Mm-hmm.
or why they're channeling it in a particular way is really fascinating to me. I feel like I'm endlessly challenged by fiction. So I guess that jumped out to me because anytime like a novel is speaking about literature or about craft or having some sense of like meta commentary on what I'm reading, I instantly like pull it out. So I guess
I
that's where it's
see.
coming from me, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And it's something I already noticed. You asked me before, prior to hitting record, you asked me before if I'm familiar with your channel, but I have watched a couple of your videos just to put you on the spot. But especially the two videos in particular that I watched were the ones where you like talk at length about booktubing, and there was one where you do the existential rant. I believe it was something called like an existential rant about your work. I forget the exact title, but you don't, you know
Yes.
which one I'm talking about. You're gripping a blanket under your chin,
Yes, absolutely.
and you
My most vulnerable moment on YouTube. Yes.
yeah, I was very impressed I'm very impressed whenever YouTuber can display vulnerability. That's something I could never do, I think. But I noticed already that you seem very interested in craft specifically, and that in your interviews it seems like you want to almost like get to the heart of the source, you know? And I feel like in some sense I have to disappoint you, similar to what you were saying about your interview with Catherine Lacey. In that like I really don't know sometimes. I just truly don't know where things come from sometimes. It's there are moments where I like really truly black out while writing, and then I won't know how much time has passed. It'll be like 15 minutes later, and then whatever I've written, it stays that way, perhaps with like some minor alterations, but it stays that way in the final version. Those moments are very rare, but they definitely happen. And I would say the most important in the moments in the novel come from such moments of writing. And obviously, it's not completely unconscious. It's not that I'm actually blacked out, but there is a sense in which I have to let go of some kind of control, some kind of authorial, yeah, some kind of purported authorial seriousness and design in order to arrive at such moments. So I can't provide you with like the secret behind so and so scene or like how it came to be. There are of course like certain moments where I can tell you in detail about like what happened and why it happened or what kind of choice I made. I would say all in all, like for the real heart of the novel, like that's beyond my explanation, beyond anything I could say. All that aside, about this specific moment, that's interesting for me to understand that you're picking out the moments that interest you in terms of craft and like kind of meta commentary on literature. Now I understand why you're drawn to that moment. It makes sense to me. And the way I just like, if I'm just a reader of my own work, as I'm reflecting on that scene and that particular moment, what I would say, so I'm pretending I'm not the writer. Yeah, the narrator is clearly a serious reader. I think that's clear from the novel. What kind of relationship she has with books, with literature is she never really comes out straight and says it, but I think there are a couple moments scattered throughout the novel where I, as the reader, get some strong hints about her relationship with novels. And perhaps in that moment, what she's conveying is a certain, yeah, it's a certain kind of innocence. The narrator, not the other character. The narrator perhaps espouses a certain kind of innocence as a reader, a certain kind of trust, a certain kind of openness to novels that perhaps she feels is stifled by overly academic, overly, especially moralistic readings of literature, a reading of literature that is designed to protect people from certain content, a reading of literature that aims to moralize, that aims to teach, that aims to inhibit, that aims to censure, that aims to somehow obscure in order to protect someone from a harsh truth or something unpleasant. And I think the narrator is expressing in that moment a strong disdain for that kind of reading.
I had like 10 thoughts that came up while you were speaking right now. So let me, I'm going to try
Okay.
to distill what I'm thinking about all of this. So it's interesting that you watched that video of mine because I guess when I pick up on things while I'm reading novels about, meta commentary or about craft and literature, I guess first I want to say with doing this podcast and you not being able to, I guess, provide like a clear-cut answer as to the source of things, like to me, that does not feel disappointing. I feel like having the opportunity to speak with you in itself and just talk about the book and try to think through it is like, I don't know, my biggest joy as a reader and now as a podcaster. Like, I just get so much joy out of it. So even if we
Mhm.
don't come away with, clear answers on things, I think that's the purpose of this novel and about novels generally. And I mean, going to that video that I posted, like, I've been thinking a lot about, I guess, performance and about being online with books and about having my face, on the internet and thinking about like, me giving my opinions on fiction, like what is the purpose of it, why am I doing it, why am I
Mhm.
trying to appear to be smart, for example, or be a critic when I'm not, and thinking about, aside from that, like the function of criticism and trying to find the right answers or make arguments about fiction. I like when I read novels that sort of question whether there are answers, whether it's even, I guess, relevant to, I don't know, like, I guess, question the role of criticism generally. So, I mean, I guess aside from this, I would love to know your thoughts about criticism and thinking about books on that level for you. Like, I guess as a reader, how does your reading life factor into your writing life, and how do you think about literature on that front?
One thing I even wrote this down in my notes. I quoted you from the video where you rant about your booktubing. I'm very sorry to do this to you, Jalen.
No, I
This
love
is
this.
just
This is
how
amazing.
this is just how I work. But you said something about how you're trying to figure out what I like about literary fiction, why I'm so drawn to literary fiction as a form. But I wrote this down in my notes ahead of the interview because that question, similar to what I was saying earlier about my decision. By the way, I had promised to tell you like the story, but I feel like I did not actually tell you the story. So I'm sorry about that. I I did not do as I promised. As in that moment, I feel like this question of you, this is me just interpreting you, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But this question about why you like literary fiction, why you're drawn to that particularly, as opposed to, let's say, genre fiction or more, what would be the more polite way of describing fiction that's not literary or like not, I guess, like more commercial fiction. Is that what people say? I'm
Yeah,
very
I
out of
think so.
touch. I'm extremely out of touch. I'll go into why I'm very out of touch soon enough. But whatever that kind of fiction is. But I think that question is getting at something very, 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 very complicated, which is probably why you can't answer it. Or maybe you've already answered it since your video. I'm not sure. Yeah, because to me, it's a question not simply about like, why is your taste the way it is? Why don't you like what other people might like? I think it's a very spiritual question. And I mean that quite seriously in the sense that it's a question of art, it's a question of the role of art in a person's life, what that art is supposed to do for you as a reader once you've, turned the last page, once you return back to quote unquote real life. And I think literary fiction, again, I don't really know what the contemporary terms are. I just use the word literature. I'm very snobby. This is now to answer your other question. I really love literature. I'm obsessed with it. And yeah, it's the most important thing in my life in some sense. Not the most, yeah, it is one of the most important things in my life. And writing for me is some kind of weird, perverted, distorted outgrowth of that love and of that reverence. I feel real reverence for certain works of literature and quite unabashedly so. And this might also be my weakness in some sense. I'm very conscious of this, that I have almost a certain slavish instinct about myself that might also kind of show through in YN in the book. But in terms of like reading and my relationship with reading, it's a huge part of my life. I was a reader before I was a writer. I was a reader before I was much of anything else, to be honest. My taste, though, is actively, intentionally out of touch. Nearly everything I read is in translation, first of all, translated from other languages, that is. I know some German, so I can read a little bit in German, but of course not as well as I do in English. But yeah, my heroes in literature, I have no other real good term for them, but I have kind of like a pantheon of writers that I really, 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 really love. And there's about 10 of them. I won't be pretentious and list all of them, but these writers who are all dead, by the way, um, yeah, my work would not exist without them. I'm 100% sure about this. That said, if there's one thing that these writers have taught me, which is many things though, the one thing for sure is that I cannot imitate them. I should absolutely not imitate them, because they themselves refuse to imitate other people, or rather, not even refused, but they just were constitutionally designed not to imitate other people. So, as much as these people influenced me, it's a very oblique form of influence. It's an influence that might not be very visible on the page, that has completely shaped my sort of relationship with art, which is again for me a relationship with life itself, with my own consciousness.
Another question for you on that is like this interview is so interesting to me because I feel like I kind of love it, so I hope you're okay with it. But this is just so interesting because I feel like the novel is reckoning with these questions in terms of identity and literature in an interesting way. Last question here before I go back to maybe the meat of the plot, I guess. But in terms of your like own relation to those works and like your understanding of them and how they apply to you personally, like do you ever I guess I get worried, and maybe that's why I do this podcast, is because I want to like reaffirm my ideas about novels potentially and my own intelligence about them. And is that something that you're thinking about at all when you're reading, or do you just kind of see it as your own personal response to the literature? I guess my question's going back to like criticism potentially, or
I
like
see.
frameworks for understanding literature and how like
Ah.
is that something that you're preoccupied with or not, I guess.
No.
Okay, love that.
No. As I mentioned earlier, when I was writing these essays about, I wrote some reviews about books and stuff, some essays. They were more like essays than reviews, really. And I made that dramatic statement about how every word was a lie. And I still stand by that because it's just not how I read. It doesn't reflect how I read. Like a book review would be utterly not the ultimate form in which my relationship with a novel would come to be. If anything, this novel, what I wrote, YN, is my review of everything that I've read and loved, which is to say, it's an anti-review review. But yeah, as for criticism, literary theory, things like that, I don't poo-poo it, like I'm not dismissive of that world. And I mentioned earlier this friend of mine with whom I have a lot of discussions about books. But she studies literature seriously, and she knows a great deal more than I do about that side of literature, in addition to being an extremely perceptive and profound reader. And so I don't at all dismiss that side of things. But for me personally, as a reader, no, I don't like, practically speaking, I read almost nothing online. I don't read reviews or essays about books, really. I read a lot of novels. Again, I read the canons of the writers that I really love, and I read philosophy. Sorry, it's a very practical answer, but it's kind of the only way I can really start to answer the question. I like to read the original texts. That is kind of my key. That's the ground of my relationship. And it's not because I think I have the ultimate perspective, or that I think my opinion or my interpretation or my analysis is the utterly correct one, is the only one. I don't even really think about it in that way when I read. When I read, I try to read with a certain measure of innocence, with a certain, yeah, openness to the text. I don't really try to go out of my way to explain it. Sometimes I do, and sometimes I take notes, but I just know. Yeah, this is this is not a very technical answer. This is why I can never be a book critic, and I could never, do the work that you do, Jalen. Like, and I think it's definitely a certain kind of talent, and it just that talent does not fall upon me. I must say, yeah. Like when I read, it just kind of like enters me and just sort of like mixes with a bunch of stuff and just kind of stays there. Some of it goes stale, other stuff like suddenly sprouts flowers, other stuff uh, turns into poison. I don't know. It's just like a one big melange of like experience that I don't feel pressure, personal pressure to somehow ascertain what it's doing. That said, like I am a very, very, very picky reader. I'm extremely open to the work when I'm reading it, and I know that the work is something that I want to be engaged with. But prior to that moment, practically speaking, again, like within the first page, I can usually tell whether or not I'm going to like a book. And this is a very mysterious experience for me. It's something I again cannot quite explain why it's the case. I trust my taste absolutely in these moments, and I I frequently think about Nietzsche. He once said that he can like if he meets a person, he can just like kind of tell what their soul is like. It's like he can almost like smell it off of them. I forget exactly what he said, but that's kind of how it's lingered in my mind that he can like smell a person's soul, like the quality of the soul. But I kind of have this, I think I have this ability with the first page of any book. I can kind of like smell, I can smell the writer. And obviously I'm a writer, so I'm very like attuned to people's use of language, to the texture, to sort of like the subliminal messaging, to kind of the kind of image they want to present of themselves, to what they're trying to persuade me of. Like I'm very yeah, like I'm very sensitive to these elements already, but somehow in the form of a novel especially, within the first page I can really tell whether or not it's a work that I want to commit myself to. And once I do commit though, I am there until the end. I'll be there and I'll take basically everything that the writer wants to throw at me, and I at that point like I just surrender. And of course that's for me that's the most magical part of reading, the surrender to the work.
I love that. Thank you for speaking on that because I guess my question stems from a lot of anxiety that I've had about, as you can tell from my internet presence, like about all of this. So to go back to, the meat of the book before I ask for some, final book recommendations, I have to ask you about, the latter half of the book, of course, without spoiling, but just about how this novel really explores, surrealism and thinking about when the narrator gets into the depths of her head and or in the love of Moon, how we reach the sanctuary and the characters there and how the novel closes. I'm just curious as to how you think about those sections now and how you thought about surrealism in this book.
This is not the final say on the book in any way, but I generally view the novel as being composed of three parts, pretty evenly spaced out. So there are 12 chapters. So the first four chapters roughly take place in Berlin. Then, and in those chapters, what it's her having this, yeah, this moment basically of spiritual conversion, love at first sight, these two tropes, and kind of how it affects her life. Then we have the second third of the book, which takes place in Seoul. That's where there's more of this like this attempt to come physically close to the object, which is in this case Moon. Then the third part, so the third and last part, so the last four chapters, this was actually the hardest part to write for me. It was the part that came together last. It's the part that underwent a lot of changes, that looks nothing like it was in the beginning. For a long time, I just kind of struggled with with the final part, final third of the book without really understanding why. But then quite late in the process, I realized why it was so difficult for me. Yeah, it made sense that it was difficult because in some sense, that final third, again, I'm sorry to continuously make this disclaimer, but I really feel like as the author, I should not try to assert certain claims about the book, but it seems to me as a objective reader of the novel that the final third part of this book is in some sense impossible. It has to be an impossible space, because again what's happening in the first two thirds, which are taking place and that I did quite purposely in two distinct locales, two not metropolises, is that even how you say the word? I have a lot of problems with pronunciation because I did not really speak for the first 10 years of my life. In these two major cities, these two urban centers that have a lot of a certain kind of image, I would say, in the global schematic at the moment. As the reader, as I read the book, it seems to me that we kind of leave these two spaces, and then in this third part, it has to be an impossible space. And I think that's partly why the third part was difficult for me to write, why it took me so long to kind of pin it down, but why as well the texture probably feels very different from the earlier parts of the novel. Yeah, and that impossibility, I guess that's the interesting question. Like why is it impossible? What is this third space, this third zone? But as I was writing that part, I always referred to it privately as the third zone. Before it really came together, I would always think to myself, okay, it's the third zone. Like something's happening in this third zone. Yeah, and the best way I can describe it is that it simply has to be impossible. In many ways, that third section remains impossible, even after one finishes reading it, I think, not to assume things of the reader, but there is still a sense of impossibility, I feel like. I don't know if that resonates with you in your reading of that part.
It does. And I think what maybe speaks to that is like my desire to instantly like reread it, I guess, or to continue grappling with it because I mean it does feel like it takes a quite significant shift towards the end. And it was really interesting, like, reflecting back on the book and looking at the different chapters and looking at their titles and seeing how this thing works structurally,
Mm-hmm.
what the ending is really doing there. And I think the best fiction, raises those questions and asks more and more of the reader. That's what I like, at least. In terms of the structure of this book and the 12 chapters and titling them, I know I keep asking you questions to like pin down your process on them. Or maybe you could just speak on how you, I guess, knew when the novel was finished and embracing like the impossibility of that final part. Like, when did you kind of come to terms with that as a writer?
So there's a practical side of the story, which is that I was literally working up until the last possible moment. Apologies to my publisher. The less practical and possibly the more interesting answer to the question is that, yeah, not to evade your question again, but I feel like this has been an interview of evasions. I'm very sorry, but it's there's a certain strange quality of, I call it inevitability. There's a certain moment when I just know that a scene or moment, everything from the microscopic level, like the choice of a word, the shape of a sentence, up to something larger like a scene, and the way the different sections are working within the scene. There's a certain quality of inevitability that I'm always looking for, and I can tell when the writing has not yet arrived there. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes that inevitability is reached quite quickly. Yeah, almost in spite of myself. Like I'll just write something and I'll be like, okay, it's just going to stay this way until the end. There's nothing to change. And when I feel that way, this inevitability has nothing to do with perfection. It has nothing to do with semantic polishedness. I'm not interested in that. And you probably noticed as a reader of the book, but like the writing, I mean, how I would describe my own writing very loosely is that there is a certain crystalline quality to it. It is very precise. But at the same time, like it's very important for me as a writer that there are frayed ends, that there is a certain unfinished quality, that there's a certain unconscious slippage in everything that I do. And so this inevitability has nothing to do with the veneer of it, with something just seeming polished or clean, or that it clicks together perfectly, or that the plot is now seamless, or that now it makes sense. It has nothing to do with that. Literally, for me, it has nothing to do with these elements. Perhaps in some sense, I must, of course, as someone who is writing a novel that ultimately will reach readers, of course, I must make some considerations for, some level of legibility. But ultimately, for me, like in my most selfish of writerly hearts, like that is not a concern to me. This inevitability, this sense that like, okay, this is what it needs to be. Its master, its final master is one that I, again, cannot quite describe, that I don't really have the tools of description for. It's just a certain conviction that the texture, the color, the suggestiveness, the mystery. I'm noticing even myself that I keep using this word, and it's something I wanted to talk about earlier when you were asking about my relationship with literature. But this quality of mystery for me is extremely important, and which is why I insist in some sense that I don't understand some things about my own work. And that inevitability then is not so much one that accords with my own expectations of the text, but something else. And again, I don't know what that something else is. I can't tell you what it is, but yeah, it's some elaborate constellation of reactions, of intuitions, of insinuations. I don't know. Yeah, I really don't know what it is. I'm just using random words right now, random complicated sounding words to try to describe it. But with that final third part, to return to your question, it's particularly more difficult with that section to like understand when it reached that, like that point of inevitability. Again, because I feel more and more that it had to be impossible, that that final section, these final four chapters had to be somehow very, yeah, somehow not, yeah, I'm trying to think of another word for impossible, not be possible. Um, and so it was harder for me to actually grasp when I was actually done with them, if that makes sense. I don't know if this is making sense, but so maybe in some sense it hasn't reached that inevitable point and I'm not aware of it. That could be very well possible too. In no way do I look at my novel and think this is a perfect work of art. Like this is finished. This novel is, yeah, I'm looking at it right now on my desk. Yeah, that it's somehow exactly what it should be. Maybe it's not. I have no idea. Maybe in there is like this extra limb of space that I haven't yet inserted myself into. And if I had gone there, the book could have ended differently. I really don't know. But in general, like all I can hope for is that I approach as much as I can this point of inevitability.
I think that answer so beautifully kind of captures what I think this book is doing. The certain, like, I guess, unpinnability of the book. And I guess all I have to say, I'm failing for words right now as well in terms of trying to summarize my thoughts on this book with you here. But I think that was such a great way of explaining it. And I feel like that's why I was so moved by it, is because of how much I felt challenged by it, and also the mystery of the novel itself was so invigorating for me to read as a reader. So I guess to cap it all, just to say I loved it, I guess. It was really fun to read. And I think that's probably the best way to kind of come away from a novel, that, or the experience that I look for as a reader. But yeah, do you mind just providing a few book rec?
Oh man. So I mean, earlier you were asking, yeah, when I was talking about literature and stuff, and I don't know, I didn't really mention the writers that I really love. I have book recommendations. I almost never give book recommendations. Or okay, I'm evading your question yet again. I'm really sorry.
No, it's no
Um,
worries.
I can just tell you who like my favorite writers are. I'm trying to think who you might enjoy reading personally. I saw already that you have Kafka on your shelf, his short stories, right?
Yes.
Have you
I have not
tried
read,
him
no,
yet?
never read any Kafka yet, and I need to.
Okay. I mean, he's one of my, I mean, I don't even want to say he's one of my favorite writers of all time. That like is demeaning to him, but he is, yeah, I really, really like him. Yeah.
I just
Anything.
picked up his diaries that were just published, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, that was making the rounds.
Yeah,
Um,
so that's also on my TBR, but I haven't read any of his books, so I need to get on that.
I mean, everything of his is amazing. But my favorite work of his is probably not okay, not even favorite. I just particularly like his novel The Castle. That's probably one of, yeah, maybe if I just had to make a recommendation, it would be that from Kafka. But really anything by Kafka. I'm trying to think recently what I've read that you would be interested in. A contemporary writer. So this is a writer who is actually still living. He's not like among my pantheon, but I still really, really, really like him. I really appreciate him. Um, and I would go so far as to say I think he's the most important living writer right now. And that would be Ulbeck, Michel Houellebecq, the French writer. So the work of his that probably my favorite of his is actually his first novel, which the title of the English translation, so it's not the same in the French, is Whatever. That's the title of the book, Whatever. But that's very short. I think you could finish that in a couple hours, and I think it's a really good primer on his work. Very bleak, very honest, very just kind of savage. Yeah, I really really like him. And then beyond that, yeah, I don't know. There are just a bunch of writers I really Dostoevsky. I love, of course. He's one of my favorite. He's one of my heroes. Thomas Bernhard, that's an Austrian writer, writing in German. One of my heroes. Mishima. I think yeah. He has like tons of works that you can choose from. But I also really love him. Sorry, this is not a very good list. These are just writers I like. And once I like a writer, I read everything that they've written, and it doesn't matter to me if it's like bad or good. As soon as I like the writer, I can pretty much, even their bad works are a profound pleasure for me to read.
Oh, that's interesting. I love that. No, thank you for that list. I mean, these are all, I have Mishima on my list as well. Confessions of a Mask, which I think is his most popular.
Ah,
If
that's a
I,
really good one. That's his first, yeah, that's his first novel. It's also slightly autobiographical, perhaps just autobiographical, but yeah, that one's really good.
yeah, I also have this mass market paperback, I think, of, is it Spring Snow? Is that the right title? It's really pretty. I like the book as object for sure.
That's yeah, that's the first of his he has a tetralogy that he wrote at the end of his life. Like he literally penned the last word of the fourth book of this tetralogy. And then I don't know if you know his biography, but he went off and he like tried to perform a military coup. He was, yeah, he did. So basically, he wrote the last word and then like died immediately after. But that tetralogy, it's the Sea of Fertility. That's what it's called. But that's Spring Snow is the first volume of that tetralogy, and I really, really, that's probably my favorite of his works. These four books.
Thank you so much for all those recommendations. And I know, again, getting sentimental, it's my natural inclination, I guess, but I just wanted to thank you for coming on. And
No, thank you. And I mean, I found it really cool that you just really love literature, but you don't seem to be totally sure why. But I think that's so great. Like I think that kind of like that you're just sort of like drawn ahead, like the horses are just kind of speeding on ahead and you don't know why. And you're letting it take you. And now you've even set up like an entire YouTube channel and like you're doing all these things, but that you're still not sure why. I think that that tension is really important. I think that's very dynamic for me somehow. Yeah. Anyways, so thank you.
yeah, absolutely. That's really validating because like I've questioned like, deleting the channel and not doing the podcast and like all this stuff. But I mean, I'm having fun with it and I feel like I'm learning. And as long as I'm, feeling happy while doing it, I'm just gonna keep going with it and see how much I learn as a reader. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's all fun stuff. So I'm glad that you've been a part of it. And
But one thing I sense from your channel also is I'm sorry to keep showing the extent to which I watched your YouTube channel, but I think this like vibe of you trying to figure it out, you being curious about it, like you, yeah, I think that I really get I kept getting the strong sense that you're like really, you really don't know why, but but instead of registering to me as like, some kind of like lack of knowledge or lack of experience, it's quite the opposite. I think that that makes your interviews and probably like all your content probably much more, yeah, that to me that rings much truer. Like that to me has much more to do with literature than with you presenting yourself as some kind of expert or critic. Yeah, your attitude towards the channel is, to me, feels much more in connection with what literature means, I think. Thank you again for interviewing me. I appreciate it.
oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. It was truly a pleasure to meet you and talk to you. So hopefully when your next book comes out, we can maybe chat again. I would love that, but
Yeah,
not to get too ahead of
in,
myself.
in 2 decades.